We're now live.
YouTube says it's live in 38 minutes. I'm confused.
No, StreamYard says we're live.
That's weird.
You guys are live.
YouTube isn't up though yet. I'm on YouTube. Am I missing something?
You were correct.
I'm
Refresh the
seeing you on
page.
YouTube.
Wait, you are seeing them on YouTube?
I am seeing them on YouTube. So, hey, everybody, we're having one of those little technical problems.
Here we go.
Getting it sorted out. So I think we're getting ready to actually launch. And
I'm seeing them. So
Yep, there we go. Yep, now I see it. All
have
right.
a panel, everybody.
okay, well, welcome to the Connections Online panel that is termed Meet the Hiring Managers. And the idea is because, at least I do, I get so many questions and so many people coming up to me say, I want a job in Wargaming, or I want to learn how to get a job in Wargaming. How do you get those jobs in Wargaming? I thought we'd do a panel of people who have either hired or influenced hiring, because a lot of time in organizations, the person that pulls the trigger is way up in the chain of command. They have no idea what a Wargamer is. They just look at a bunch of paperwork. Influenced the decision on hiring or hired Wargamers to talk about broadly sort of the market, the career, what they might look for in hiring, what sort of people get hired, I mean, with experience levels and that sort of stuff into Wargaming, and sort of how you might approach the entire problem of identifying Wargaming jobs and then putting yourself out there for them. So we have what I consider to be a sort of a representative cross-section, a little Navy heavy this time. We're going to redo this panel in Connections US, and it'll be a little Army heavy then. We a little bit Navy heavy, but we have Stephen Downs Martin, who I believe the reason I wanted him on the panel is because he kind of represents the pure play consultant part of the business. And that's one way to get yourself hired, is to work as a consultant and then have people hire you for individual tasks or individual jobs. Don Marrin, on the other hand, represents the other end of the spectrum, government, Title 10, Naval War College. And so that's the sort of the government side of things. And I will, since I said that, I will also note that no one here is talking about any of their own personal experiences with respect to individuals. They are not speaking for their organization. They are not speaking about anything that has anything to do with any of their experiences. And we want to make sure that we keep it at that level because obviously this touches on human resources issues, and we don't want to get in trouble with human resources. Speaking of getting in trouble with human resources, Jeremy Sipinsky comes from the Center for Naval Analysis and FFRDC. And you'll see FFRDC is represented fairly heavily here because a lot of the more high-end games are either done by the war colleges or by the FFRDCs. And so Jeremy has that experience. Pete Pellegrino is kind of a mixed play. He's both a contractor and a pure play consultant. And so he has that contractor sensibility in addition to having worked very closely with the federal government as well. And so he can sort of talk to both sides of that issue. And finally, Steve again has experience with a different FFRDC and in this case, RAND. And each FFRDC will operate very differently. So it's really important to get different perspectives on that. And I myself have been a hiring manager. In fact, I brought Jeremy onto the team. I'm also not a pure play consultant, but rather I team with organizations to do games. And so that's yet another way as an independent to potentially get to do games. So I can speak to both of those sides of the equation. So what I'd like to do is have everybody take about 5 minutes. We'll go around the table, take about 5 minutes, talk about your experiences in hiring and talk about your experiences in terms of the career track with respect to gaming. So we'll start off with Peter Pellegrino, who I consider to be one of the best wargamers out there right now. So.
Hi, thanks, Ed. Hey, so as Ed said, I kind of run a bit of a gambit in terms of the sorts of people and jobs and hiring and types of work. But I'm going to focus my 5 minutes here primarily on the defense contractor support to government. So basically, I'm looking for guys when Don doesn't hire a govy, and they end up having to hire a contractor. That's kind of that's where I fall in. And so the big thing to remember with that type of work, excuse me, is that it is defined by the government contract. So like any other job, and a lot of the advice I'm going to give here in the next 5 minutes or so applies to whether you're trying to get a job as an aerospace engineer or a wargamer. It's just solid how to go after a job. And yet, as blindingly obvious as some of this is from my perspective, apparently not, given the resumes I end up reading. So it bears repeating that this is just good, job hunting 101 type of stuff that somehow seems to get skipped over, either because applicants are very young, relatively speaking, in terms of experience in the industry and whatnot, and don't have a deep resume, or they're the other extreme. They've already done a 20+ year in the military, and they're trying to tell you everything fascinating they've done, and to include that the Navy Achievement Medal they got as a second lieutenant because they were a public affairs officer. And they want me to sift through their professional resume, their professional biography, and see if I can find inside of there somewhere something relevant to wargaming, which when I have a stack of resumes to look through, just got you moved into the next pile, not the continue pile. Okay, so like any of the jobs, you've got to get at the job description. Find out what it is that the government contract is looking for in the first place. And this is just understanding that you've got to go after the skill set. You've got to demonstrate that you have the skill set that the position description, the PD, is advertising for. Don't make me guess if you have the skill set. Don't make me infer you have the skill set. Tell me right up front, I can do the 6 things you're looking for in a war game and whatever I'm looking for, general war game designer, war game analyst, etc. Tell me you can do those 5, 6, 7 things right up front. Don't tell me 5 or 6 jobs you did that's related to. Tell me you have the design experience, or you have the graphic layout experience, you have the project management experience, you have the communication skills, etc. Tell me you have those, and then show me. Okay, and that's where your relevant experience comes in. So what I'm looking for really is you to lead with the I can do the job you're looking for. Here are the things I think are relevant to that job. And here's proof from my past that I can do those 5, 6, 7 things. That's where your previous experience comes to play, and the two now match together. And I can tell on the front page, I've received 8, 9, 10-page resumes. No one's life is that exciting. Okay, forget it. All right, if you can't catch me, if I can't see that you're worth further consideration on the front of the first page, you've wasted my time. And I'm just going to move on depending on how many applicants I have for the position. Okay, so lead with what you can do, and don't worry if you don't have 100% match. For every little thing that the position description requires is asking for, you don't have all of them. Lead with what you think is the most important of all of those. Make it your first one. You're going to have to tailor the resume, and this is more targeted at the old people who want to just use one resume, the headhunter resume, that works for every single job out there. It's their biography. It's all the fitness reports they ever got just stapled together in chronological order. As opposed to tuning it. This job, I probably need to lead with my leadership skills. But this position in this different company, I need to lead with my organizational and project management skills. And this third company, I need to lead with my creativity and those sorts of skills, which means you're going to have to take the time to read the PDs, figure out what it is that people are looking for, and to shove that into that front resume. Resumes are not dead. I know people think that somehow, it's not cool anymore. Nobody does resumes anymore. They do YouTube videos. And no, not if you want to work for a defense contractor who's trying to get connected to a government contract. We're old school resumes and cover letters, right? And so don't think that wargaming is something different or magic or special that doesn't require solid job application skills using that kind of classic, what's the position description you're asking for? I can do it. Here's proof from my past. And a cover letter never hurts. Right, that was my 5, Ed.
You're muted,
Hey,
Ed.
yeah, I know. Thanks, Pete. Okay, let's move on to Jeremy.
Great, thanks. I second every bit of Pete's advice on crafting a resume. I think it's vitally important. to really highlight those skills. I'm going to take a little bit different track. I'm gonna hit on some of those skills that I think is important for wargamers to bring to the table when we're looking to hire somebody, or when I'm looking for somebody that I want to be working with. And it's important to realize that there are two different tracks here. There's the we're looking for an experienced wargamer, and then there's the we're looking for a new wargamer, a new hire, someone on the wargaming team, but not necessarily an experienced wargamer. I'm going to talk about the new wargamers here as opposed to the experienced wargamers. If you're interested in experienced wargamers, CNA happens to have an experienced wargamer job position open and available. Feel free to go find that on CNA's website, and you can find, and I'm not going to talk to that at all, so I don't get in trouble with HR. So for a new wargamer, we at CNA rarely hire new wargamers. We will hire analysts on the wargaming team, but we're not necessarily looking to hire new wargamers. Wargame design is a very small part of what we do. And at CNA, we're analysts first. We're analysts before we are wargamers. And we need to be able to do all of the skills that an analyst can do. And we need to contribute analytically to projects before we're contributing wargame design pieces to projects. Even if you're only working on wargaming projects, the actual design, development, and facilitation of a wargame is a very small part of the whole project lifespan that you would be expected to be working on. But not every analyst has the skills that are necessary to be a wargamer, right? I know plenty of very, very good analysts that would make very, very bad wargamers, because the wargaming skill set requires all of the analyst skill sets and then some things on top of it. In order to be somebody that I would really want to work with side by side on a wargaming team, you need to have excellent communication skills. Oral and written communication skills. You're going to need to be communicating with sponsors. You're going to need to be communicating with players. You're going to need to be writing scenarios, and you're going to need to be writing analytic reports. Just because you could figure out a combat resolution table doesn't mean you could write a scenario that's captivating and engaging. That doesn't mean that you could take all of the interesting things that got said within a war game and write a concise, useful insights page in a page and a half that says, here are all of the things that need to happen coming out of this war game. So excellent communication skills are really a must, both oral and written. You're going to need to be able to demonstrate or have a stage presence. You're going to need to be comfortable standing in front of a room, demanding attention, telling people what they need to do, and you need to appear comfortable. And you're going to need to be able to think on your feet in that environment. And having that stage presence or having something in your resume that shows us that you can be comfortable in that situation is important. Not all analysts need to have that. But it's really important if you want to make the jump from being an analyst to also being a wargamer. Project management is key. You're going to need to be able to structure a research project. So having some demonstrated capability to think through a large problem, chunk it up into small pieces, manage teams, work as a part of a team, right? Accept tasking and delegate tasking, knowing how to take a large project and do it step by step by step. Most of our war games need to be broken up into that. Most of our projects are going to have a war game as a small finite component of it. There needs to be an attention to detail. You need to make sure that you know all of the fiddly bits that are associated with a project and being able to contribute to those. Flexibility is a huge one. No war game ever goes off as planned, and we are constantly running like chickens with our head cut off at the end. And if you can't take an environment, both as an analyst or a war gamer, where you're constantly scrambling at the last minute, you're going to have a hard time working on a lot of the games that we run. And finally, as I butt up against my 5 minutes, creativity. Right, that's where the game design and development aspect are coming into this, but it's such a small part of what we do. Design, development, and facilitation is maybe a third of the time and the effort that we spend designing our games. The research leading up to it, the sponsor communication, defining what the game is And then the analytic part on the back end, where we're creating a report and passing that off to actually create some analytic end game for our sponsors. Those are the heaviest lifts of what we do. The game design is a couple of weeks and a small portion of it. The game development is a larger piece, and the game facilitation is very, very short. So if all you're doing is telling me that you're creative and can do that, that's great, but can you do all of the other things on your time, or am I just going to hire you for 25% of the work week? So with that, I'll stop and pass it over to the next.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Let's go to Stephen.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or good night, depending on where in the world you are. First of all, these notes that I'm going to provide you are based on my own experience, both as getting hired as a professional wargamer, but also being on search and selection committees for hiring wargamers. And like several of our panel, I'm talking about professional wargaming for the military, DoD, government, aerospace engineers, aerospace companies, and so on. So for those of you who are very young out there and new, why should you listen to me? After all, I'm old, grey, and cynical. But so are a lot of hiring managers. The real reason you should listen to me is because I got my first professional wargaming job as a senior wargamer at a large wargaming department of a large DoD-related organization. I'm following Ed's rule of not stating where that was, but since you know where I've been for the last 20 plus years, you can guess. I got that job despite having virtually no wargaming experience and simultaneously being totally honest about that. So if you're new to wargaming, you should probably listen up, because this is gold. So as Peter Pellegrino pointed out, lay the groundwork. Very few, if any, wargaming positions will, quote, seek a wargamer with 5 years experience, full stop, okay? It may be the most important requirement, somewhere in the middle, and there's an example on PACSIMS recently from Aimpoint Research, asking for a wargame analyst. Wargame is right there in the title. But there will be a slew of other requirements, and you can bucket these, and it's important to put them into buckets. Business skills. They'll be explicitly stated either in the explicit requirements or implied by the job description and implied by the description of the company or organization. Business skills such as project management, dealing with clients, producing concrete actionable results. I saw that phrase in one of the jobs I've seen advertised. Writing, communicating, etc. That's one bucket. You will need domain skills dealing with what is being wargamed. Somebody who wants to hire a wargamer to deal with medical topic will give preference to a wargamer with medical knowledge or knowledge about medical simulation and so on. So what domain is being emphasized by the job description? Supporting skills, analysis, coding, math, science of some sort, psychology, research methodology, and so on. So being experienced in skills, add as many of those as possible, increases your probability of beating other people who are equally or even more skilled at wargaming than you. Think of your life as a deck building card game, where the cards are your talents. And going back to the two previous speakers about tailoring your resume, the combinations of your cards in a card game provide different levels of value. The combinations of your talents, okay, is what provides value to the hiring manager. Do not expect others to believe you when you say how good you are. It's all very well putting on your resume, I know how to do this and I did this at this job. For every past and future project or position, politely request from the management or leadership of that organization a thank you letter. Most of them will say yes. And even better, they'll ask you to draft that letter for them because, you know, it's a pain drafting such letters. So do so. Don't go over the top, but do so. I can provide you afterwards, if you like, with some examples of what I got out of people. Getting hired, as Peter said, is basically a project. It's the first time your hiring manager sees how good or bad you are at a project by how you approach getting hired, okay? How do you do a project? Well, you identify the client. In your case, the client is the hiring manager. For a project, what is the client or sponsor's objectives? It's written down for you in the job description. Pay attention to it, okay? Pick out the explicit and implicit requirements, put them into the buckets I've mentioned before, put those on your cover letter, short paragraph for each bucket, explaining how you satisfy them, all right? Now, this is the gold, okay? When there is a requirement that's absolutely required, but you have almost no experience in it because you're new or you wish to switch field, do not just leave it out, and do not lead with, I don't have this, or although I don't have this, I ... Because as soon as the hiring manager reads that, your resume and application goes into that round filing cabinet on the floor next to him, okay? What you do is you go back through your experience and you find something or some things that relate to it, to the requirement. And you explain how you have that experience. And you leave it to the hiring manager to decide if, given all your other pieces of value that you bring to the table, whether that is good enough to hire you. You're making it easy for the hiring manager to be interested in you and interested in hiring you. So when it came to wargaming in the cover letter that I wrote, I was honest, totally honest. Quote, I have led and participated in research projects, because research was a big word that kept appearing in the job description, in research projects using interviewing, man-in-the-loop computer-based war games, e.g. SimNet, that's what it was called at the time, computer simulations and quantitative analytic methods. This was for a job doing very much analog wargaming. I left it to the decision maker to decide if this satisfied their wargaming requirements enough that I could be hired so they could obtain the other value I brought to the table, and I got the job. I was up against 80 other people competing for the position. So, summary, when you are applying, there will usually be someone better at wargaming or with more experience or more famous than you applying for the same position. If you rely only on your wargaming skills, the probability of getting hired is really low. Broaden your technical skills at all times, broaden your domain knowledge and your project management and people skills beyond wargaming. Shamelessly collect letters of commendation, all to make it easy for the decision maker to offer you the position. Don't make the decision maker fight human resources as to why you should have the job despite being weak in certain areas. Make it easy for the decision maker, him or her, to go ahead and hire you. And that's my 7-minute version of 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Let's now go over to Steve's Worman from Marrin.
Hi, everybody. How are you? So in the space that I work, much like Jeremy, we tend to be researchers first, and this is sort of the thing when thinking about how to approach this that I wanted to highlight, which is, and this has been touched on by several other people, and Stephen mentioned it. Sort of wargaming in the space in which I work is a research methodology. It's one of several different ones, right? So rarely ever do, or at least in my experience, have I seen positions that have wargamer in the title. You see analyst, researcher, political scientist, what have you. And so it's one of many research methodologies, and it's sort of knowing when to utilize that methodology. So what I like to highlight is the fact that it's about the same things in the space in which I work that make a good wargamer and make people, when thinking about people that I want to be working with and have on my teams, are people that bring a lot of different skills to the table, right? You can either And again, it's a little different. I think there's this question about sort of experience versus novice, or more junior war gamers. But typically you can either, from a methodological standpoint or an experiential standpoint, have sort of either deep substantive domain expertise or more general, right? So those are the people that bring the land warfare knowledge or the air war or the naval expertise versus the more general expertise in game design and things like that. But that, again, that's a small portion uh, of the overall requirement. I really liked, and wanted to echo what Jeremy said about sort of the design portion, the sponsor engagement, that all that background work is really where the actual work goes on, and we tend to focus on the sort of the production piece because that's the forward facing piece. But there's a lot of meetings and really finding out, like, what is the question that the sponsor is after, right? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And so trying to highlight those skills and bring the, how to say it, the way that you abstract problems forward, I think is really important and sort something to highlight, right? And how it's one of many different tools in your arsenal, right? Because a lot of times the actual design portion will involve all those other research methodologies that you need to do. And so being able to say, well, not only can I do this thing, but I also have all these other tools that I can bring to bear to answer the problem, is important, because that also will tell you when somebody's approaching you to say, hey, I want to do a war game. Sometimes the answer is, maybe we don't actually want to do a war game for this. And so knowing sort of where those boundary conditions are is really important. So don't undersell the non-wargaming pieces of your resume or your experience, because those are actually, I think, critically important, and they make you a flexible thinker, and able to tackle the problem in a lot of different ways. And it reflects in your designs too, right? You can find really unique solutions to problems that other people can't. So that's the advice that I would give, that I don't think duplicates all the other good advice that you've heard.
Thanks a lot. And now over to Don for the Title 10 experience.
Thanks, Ed. I think the sequencing has actually worked out well, because it's kind of helped me frame my thoughts on this, hearing some of my colleagues here. I would offer that it's important to think about the organization that you're interviewing with and how they utilize wargaming and how they approach wargaming. Because I think it's been interesting in hearing my colleagues here at certain organizations, I think specifically RAND and CNA, that look at, and we certainly agree, is wargaming is an analytical method. But once you're in the wargaming department at the Naval War College, that's kind of your bread and butter, and that's what we do. And so we look to exclude other analytical efforts from our plate, if you would. We have enough work to do in just the wargaming, area. So we typically, our war gamers, we do kind of focus on wargaming first and foremost. And so it's our principal, if you would, analytic tool that we use. There are other folks at the college, and there are other job opportunities at the Naval War College to be able to do other types of research methodologies. And I would also offer, we have a pretty large tent when we think of what wargaming is. It's not just strictly two-sided wargaming. Move step, there's tabletops, there's facilitated workshops, many things that we do that we would believe fall under kind of the wargaming rubric. But I think it's important, rather than reiterating what my colleagues have said, to kind of think about your personal strengths and where maybe you would best fit in different types of organizations. And I offer that in the case of, we've kind of moved more towards a specialization model and away from a generalist model. When I came to the War College 20 years ago, we were really kind of a generalist model. We kind of self-developed war gamers through an OJT process. and you ended up doing everything. And you were kind of a, plug and play. You could be the lead analyst, you could be the developer, designer. We even kind of moved towards this idea of design and development being bifurcated in your game process, as opposed to just a game team that kind of does, soup to nuts from task identification all the way through analysis. So we've and we're even moving down that track even more so with our current leadership into these divisions, which are focused on specialization, specifically design, in which Pete is in, analysis, development, and game director. And I'm the lead for the game director group, if you would, in our ops division. So we've kind of begun to more specialize in some regards to help us from a hiring perspective. So rather than trying to find somebody who can do all the things that Steve and Jeremy talked about, we're looking now to kind of specialize, at least initially, with the opportunity that once you come into the organization and are able to contribute in a specialized area, you then are able to grow into those other areas. And we've done this for some time now, particularly with analysts. We've kind of hired analysts separately, if you would, to some degree, from folks that we see on a design or development, ultimately a game director track in our organization. And so I offer that as something as a potential future wargamer. Kind of look at the organization and see how your talents would be used, and see if that is or isn't a good fit for you. But there are different models out there, I guess I would offer, in how your talents may be used and how you may be integrated into the structure or the fabric of the wargaming department. As far as a background, I think the one that we typically like to harp on a lot, because we don't find a lot of folks with a lot of background, wargaming background, applying to us, is operational planning expertise. If you've got operational planning expertise as a staff member on a military staff, and you understand the operational planning process, that tends to put you kind of a leg up on being able to do a lot of the wargaming and analytical activities that we conduct in the wargaming department. You understand the lingo and how to then develop and design activities to get at research objectives that oftentimes are tied to either, in our case, operational or strategic planning issues or challenges. So I think that's about it from my perspective. Ed, back over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Don. I appreciate it. Now I went last, so I could sort of give you my perspective as well. I have both hired as an FFRDC person as well as I run my own company now, and I work for some others. I think that the way I'd like to phrase this is, the first thing you need to do is ask yourself. Let's work through this as a role-playing game, right? The first thing you need to do is ask yourself why on earth you would want to be a professional game designer. Okay. Now, generally people have two answers to that. Now there's kind of a third, but there's two answers to that. One is, oh my gosh, I played war games and I played games since I was 3 years old. This is what I will love to do. It's my hobby. I love it so much. And it would be so cool to do it as my day job. And for you, I would point out to you a couple of things if you're in that category. For fun, your alcohol problem, somebody wrote in the chat. I would point out a couple things for you. One is, it's a great way to ruin a hobby, okay? Because it's a job, okay? It's like any other job. There are jerks you have to deal with. There are bigger jerks you have to deal with. And there's even bigger jerks you have to work for, okay? So it's like any other job. And so if you think you love it so much, the best way to kill it is to turn it into a job. Okay. The second thing I think you need to know is that there are things that you're probably missing because you spent every waking hour since you were 3 years old playing games. Okay. And those have to do with analytic. We've heard this a lot here, with analytical skills and with social skills. And truthfully, 80% of professional wargaming activities involve social skills. They involve management of other people, management of yourself, management of players. And not being able to do that is a significant drawback. As you've heard several other people say, hey, you got to be able to moderate games and do stuff like that. Now, the other category of people who view it tend to be relatively new to the field, and they're like, hey, I play Settlers of Catan. I played a role-playing game once or twice. It's kind of cool. I don't know what I'm going to do. I've got a political science degree. So why don't I do this as my job? Because it's not a bad job. And eventually I'll become an assistant secretary of whatever, and I'll move on. But for a while, I'll do this wargaming thing. Okay. Well, that's good. You understand it's a job. But at the same time, you may not understand that you're competing for that job against people who have played war games since they were 3 years old. People who can recite, diameters of guns on ships going back all the way to the 1800s out of memory, okay? These people have a lot of experience with it, and you don't necessarily bring that experience. In addition, what you don't understand is that because you don't necessarily have all the requisite experiences, when you get to said job, you may not be doing the high-speed, low-drag stuff right away. There's a lot of stuff for you to learn. And that process of learning can be quite frustrating for people that are relatively new. But let's assume you've made poor life choices and you decide to actually become a professional game designer. Then the question becomes, who do I want to work for? Well, you kind of saw it here. There's sort of three broad categories of people to work for. One is the government, okay? And all I can say about that is you're working for the government, okay, as a game designer. And you may not be able to find a job as a game designer in the government because it's a very Byzantine process, USA jobs. You have to go through that whole process. Veterans have preference. It's a thing, okay? It's a government thing. The other is contractors. At the other end of the spectrum is contractors. Contractors will hire you. And they do put on things that they call games. And so, but that's a thing too. And I'm not going to talk too much about contractors because we unfortunately don't have a contractor representative on here. He fell through at the last minute. Turns out people who are senior war game designers are very busy. And so in the third category are think tanks. I work for think tanks right now. FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers, are think tanks. And they are very analytically focused. And they are very much focused on the quality of work and the sort of prestige type jobs. And so you have to have degrees. You have to be smart. Okay. So once you've sort of sorted that out and you apply, then you run into someone like me. Okay. And I have a problem because I'm looking for three things in my wargamer. Okay. I'm looking for, first and foremost, because I was at an FFRDC CNA, I'm looking for a good analyst. And it's not just because you're not going to survive unless you're a good analyst. Preferably a PhD in a technical field like electrical engineering or chemical engineering or something like that. Maybe math and chemistry. But I'm looking for a technical PhD who can do analysis because war games are inherently analytical. You do analysis before the war game to figure out what you're going to do. During the war game, God help you, when the players start fussing at you, you're doing on-the-site analysis. And then you have to do analysis after the war game's over. So you need a good analytical background. The second thing you need is you need to understand war games, right? But not so over the top on war games that you fall off the other side and fall into the third category, which is I'm looking for someone who is not crazy. And by that, I mean someone who has basic social skills and is not just a wargamer, and is not just someone who cannot relate to people, who cannot market, because guess what? No matter what job you take, even if you take that government job, you're going to be selling a war game to someone. Because if you don't sell it to them, you don't get paid. And so, in the government, yes, of course, you get paid by the government to do the job, but at the same time, you need task orders to do the war games, even if you're in the government. And especially if you're not in the government, you need task orders from the government or other people to do war games. And so you need those kind of social skills. You need that kind of marketing skills to be able to do things. Okay. And then if you get past me, then you get different types of jobs, right? And many people have already mentioned that there's different types of jobs for wargamers. There's potential for graphics design. There's potentially for support jobs where you're helping someone like myself or Jeremy or Steve or Pete put on the war game. And then there's the full-fledged designer, builder, developer, what everybody on this call are, who are sort of soup to nuts, can do the whole thing. Those are relatively rare positions. And those are positions you more work your way into than actually get hired into. And so I think as you're thinking about a career in professional gaming, you got to realize it's both a job, but it's a job that has a very peculiar set of unique skills that you need to have and attributes that you need to have to be successful in. And so I think you need to try to work on those skills, predominantly your analytical and personality skills, as opposed to your wargaming skills, which you probably already got down. And it also requires you to understand that it's a job that involves working with people, bringing money in, and then executing the war game. So I think that there's a larger context you need to think through as you're doing the games. So that's my statement, and I'll open it up to questions. There appears to be several questions for the panel. Okay, and what I'll do is everybody can answer. Oh, we got it up here. Question for the panel. Mentioned earlier the idea of being a domain expert who knows wargaming versus being a wargamer who requires other domain knowledge. How to balance the two when seeking a wargaming job. I'll open that up for anybody on the panel that wants to comment.
I'll take a crack at it, Ed. I think it's important for people to have an ability to be a domain knowledge expert, but that doesn't mean I would use your domain knowledge. If I'm looking for somebody to work with, I need to know that they do have the skills to become an expert in things, but we're not going to leverage that in any game. You need to be an inch deep and a mile wide about things. You're almost never going to be an expert in the war game that you're actually designing, running, facilitating, doing research for, trying to bid, trying to solicit, or doing analysis of. But I need to know that you understand the process of the research and how to build domain expertise, what domain expertise means and stands for, and how to generate that expertise so that way you can respect it when you see it in others, so that you can leverage it when you know people that have it, and that you know enough of the process so you know how deep you need to go in order to answer the questions that we have. So you need to have it, but I'm not going to use it, as weird as that sounds.
Yeah. Is anybody else?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll comment a little bit just in terms of then from the other end of the spectrum is if they're advertising for a space warfare expert because the job specifically says we're looking to expand our space and cyber capabilities, then by God, you better be a space expert, or at least convince me that you are. And then once you get your foot in the door through that particular position, then there's that opportunity to, kind of as Jeremy described, expand your own personal skill set such that at least you are cognizant and can engage competently in other domains. But if the job advert said looking for a space expert, you better talk about orbitology and satellites until you're blue in the face.
And then picking up on what Peter's just said, though, if you're not a space expert, but you have overlapping experience, apply anyway and point out how your experience relates to space and allow the hiring manager to decide whether that's good enough. Don't decide for the hiring manager that you're not actually qualified, okay? And there's two separate topics here. One is getting hired and the other is doing the job after you've been hired. So to go back to Jeremy's point, you have to be able to actually know who to go to who are experts in different domains. If after you've been hired, you're told to put together a war game about a domain. You don't have to be an expert in it. There is a trap here, however, and I've seen a war game trip over. It was a nuclear deterrence game, and the game designers were requested to write the analytic report of insights, etc., following the game, which they attempted to do. They were not, however, experts at nuclear deterrence, and that report failed miserably. So there's a trap about designing a game using experts to put it together and then analyzing it afterwards. You have to actually not just be good at analysis, you have to have domain knowledge about what it is the game is gaming when you do the follow-on analysis. Over.
Yeah, I would say that it depends on what you mean by domain analysis. A lot of times, this is another career track for wargaming. You get a domain person like a China expert who then works their way into wargaming by participating on a whole bunch of war games, learning kind of how to do it, and then they become a China wargaming expert, sort of kind of thing. I think the domain that really matters is being a good analyst, being a good person who is able to take problems apart, sort through what's important, and decide how different pieces of a component problem work together. I think that kind of skill helps you a lot, especially in areas where you don't have domain knowledge, because you get to the heart of the problem right away. And I think wargamers are particularly good at that in some cases, and especially if they've had some scientific training. So, anybody else?
Just one quick follow-up on what you just said. You implied knowing the bounds and the limits of your knowledge, which I think is super important when you're writing that, right? It's not just knowing what you know, it's knowing what you don't know. And and I think that's the thing that oftentimes wargamers are bad at, myself included in some ways. I think I know a lot about a lot of things, but I really only know things at the skin deep level. And knowing how to say, I am going to do analysis up to this point in my report, and I'm going to leave the rest for the experts, whether that's at your organization or for follow-on research, I think is a super important point, so you don't hit the problem that Stephen mentioned, which is going off the cliff and writing about something that you don't actually know about.
Yeah, and I would say that the most important domain that you need knowledge about is yourself. You need to be self-aware, self-monitoring, and have that sort of self-monitoring capability, which you see in a lot of successful people. Or you could just ask what your spouse would say about your knowledge.
Hey, Ed, if I could just, I guess, add on to that, as Pete highlighted the fact that if they're asking for a domain SME, then obviously harp on that. But if they're not, I would offer that while domain expertise is maybe beneficial, we often can go out and get that expertise by working through our sponsors to address the problem at hand. So if someone's coming to me and applying for a job, I would be much happier seeing someone with wargaming experience and expertise who then can acquire some level of domain knowledge to be able to adequately game that domain, rather than someone coming in who's a domain expert but doesn't really understand how, as we said earlier, a good analyst doesn't necessarily make a good gamer. Someone that's a good domain expert but has difficulty being able to translate that into a gaming process as an analytical, effort is really less interesting, right, to us. So I don't want to go out and have to get wargaming expertise to do a project, but I certainly can go out and get domain expertise right within our college or within the broader DoD or through FFRDCs and others. So the focus should be on the wargaming piece rather than the domain knowledge piece, which I think is kind of what we've been saying.
Yeah, there are position descriptions which emphasize a domain. And even when they don't, the description of the organization may emphasize a domain. An organization may be deeply embedded in gaming medical issues. The job description may not mention that, but you've done your research, as you should do for any project, and getting hired is a project. You've done your research, and you have to decide, whether to, if you have that domain knowledge, whether to emphasize it.
Okay, do we have another question? I think we've gotten several questions in the chat. For the panel, how would you define the distinction between a new and experienced wargamer? Is there other job experience that could build wargaming experience? And I'll just note it right up front. Phil Pornell has come up with this classification, because he likes classification systems, a classification system for wargame designers, with the meta expert being someone with expert wargamer being someone who's gotten paid to do multiple games, and a grandmaster being someone who has gotten paid to do multiple games in multiple domains. And so you could come up with rules like that. But do you guys have any thoughts on this particular question?
Well, based on my own experience, addressing the second question there first, anything that can be related to wargaming, okay, can build your wargaming experience. Human in the loop simulation, first person shooter gaming, game theory. If you can make an argument about how some experience you have relates to the wargaming that the job position is describing, go ahead and make that make those linkages in your application. If you're actually now working as a wargamer, there's a whole slew of stuff you should be experience that you should be gaining to build your wargaming experience. And it's been mentioned by earlier speakers here: facilitation, people skills, basic psychology, analysis. Wargaming is this really small core, and it links to a slew of other required skills that if you don't have, you're not going to be a very successful wargamer.
Yeah, that brings up a note I would have, which is the difference between a new and an experienced wargamer is the experienced wargamer is nervous about the design but confident in the execution. The inexperienced wargamer is confident about the design and nervous about in the execution.
So since I set up the dichotomy between the new and the experienced gamers in my opening remarks, I guess I feel obligated to try to put a fine point in that, or at least what I would call it. So I would say an experienced gamer is one that can walk into an organization and I can say, hey, there's a sponsor. Here's the problem that they had. Go run a war game, right? Build the team that you need. Come to me when you need to come to me. And because, as Ed mentioned, because you're self-aware enough to know the limits of your knowledge and know when you need to seek other advice. And then, find me when there's a problem. And in the end, I hope you run a good war game. A new wargamer is one that we would need to mentor up and provide training and tools. And we wouldn't expect you to be at the front of the game at the beginning. You're going to be assisting in the development. You're going to be assisting in the data collection. You're going to be assisting in the research and the report writing. And eventually you're going to be given a piece of the war game to design, or a mechanic or a section, and be brought up, right? That's what I would consider a new wargamer. And experienced is, ready to go, cleared hot to interact with the sponsor and do everything soup to nuts.
Another aspect of being an experienced wargamer is knowing when it shouldn't be a war game, that the sponsor's objectives are not best satisfied by a war game. And then this is where your other job experience comes in, knowing what is the best approach for the sponsor, and either passing it off to a completely different organization, and I can hear the sucking of teeth by contractors here, but you pass it off to another organization, or you propose another technique. The problem there, of course, is that all too often your sponsor's been told to go and do a war game. So now you have to do something else and call it a war game.
But that's where the analytic experience comes in, and you get to say, okay, tell me more about your organization. Tell me what you want to do. Tell me what your problems are, and let me design a war game that actually helps. If I'm unconstrained because I don't have a problem, and yes, Stephen, 100%. We've seen this problem before, right? This happens more often than you would like it to happen, and you figure out what the right war game is, and that's a key experience for a new war game, for an experienced war game designer, to be able to say, not this, do this instead, and actually, as Ed talked about skills, sell that new war game to the sponsor that came in thinking they wanted one thing, and they're walking away with something better.
I would repeat the 3 questions plus 1 that I always ask. before starting any project with the sponsor. What do you want? And you don't argue with that. The sponsor says what he or she wants. Then you drill down and, well, why do you want this? And that's where all of the details come up. The third question is, why don't you already have it? That'll tell you all about the obstacles that are hidden away in the sponsor's organization, the sponsor's own biases, etc. And finally, you want to know how much time and resources you're going to spend on this project. So you ask the sponsor, how long are you in your current position, sir or ma'am? And that tells you how long you have to actually do the game or other analytic activity. Over.
Yeah, I think part of this gets into this, both what job experience to build wargaming experience. If you look at wargaming, as we've all kind of mentioned here, in terms of its analytic nature, and that at its root, there's some sort of problem-solving framework that is represented by wargaming. So if your experience isn't using wargaming as a problem-solving framework, well, what frameworks are you familiar with? What other activities have you done that would lead me to believe that you can take that systemic kind of breakdown approach to addressing an issue? So when you first start, I mean, when I first started, I was lashed up with Steven. Okay, when I first got to the place I was at, as active duty with zero wargaming experience, they said, yeah, just hang out with him, right? And so my problem-solving framework at that point had precious little wargaming examples to kind of hang things on. As I did just experience coming from military command and from aviation community, et cetera. Over time, that framework starts to grow out a bit, to the point now where, as I start to looking at a wargaming problem, immediately my head is running through pattern matching, going, oh, this is similar to a game we did in 2018. This has features of a game that were used in 2020. I'm not going to do that thing we did in 2007 because that did not work well. But that only comes with time. Absent that time of growing that rather niche problem-solving framework, I'm looking for other frameworks that you can lean on, at least initially. And that's why, like here recently, I was rooting around in the Intel analyst community, hunting for people who I thought could potentially be decent gamers.
Okay, maybe we should move on to the next question, because I see there's several questions in the chat. What percentage of jobs does the panel estimate are contractor versus semi-permanent roles in North America?
No idea.
Okay, we can do a little analysis of this. Most of the, there's only like 4 or 5 places, plus the COCOMs, that have, and maybe a few more like Newark, that have on-site full-time wargamer type people, right? The war colleges, the combatant commands, maybe some of them are trying to spin it up. Like I know CENTCOM's trying to spin it up. A lot of that spin up is organic, so they're refragging officers on the command staff to do the wargaming. The joint staff and the entire H-seat program over at DHS, which is a thing in and of itself. So there's a fixed number. In terms of contractors, there's also a relatively fixed number. There's BOOS, there's SAIC, there's Group W, there's probably a couple of more, but it's not a huge, I think there's this tendency to think of, there's this mass of wargaming jobs available out there right now, and it's not a huge field of play. There's a lot of jobs right now, I think, because certain organizations, like I said, the COCOMs, are trying to build up staff in wargaming. Because they don't want to pay RAND or CNA or MITRE to do their wargaming. Like MITRE is building up a staff to do wargaming right now. And so I think there's a sense that there's an opportunity here, but it's onesies and twosies for each of those. So based on that, you would say, okay, 20 government, maybe 20 to 30 contractor organizations, ignoring DHS and all the across the river players. And you're looking at 2 or 3 jobs each of those. So you're looking 60 to 100 positions, most of which are occupied. And of those, you're going to get turnover, so 10%. So 10 positions a year maybe, which is about what we're seeing, I think. But that's just my analysis. Anybody have any comment?
I would advise a completely different approach. First of all, find Find a job that you really are interested in doing, either a combination of its location, the organization, the actual job description, etc., even if it has nothing to do with wargaming, but it's problem solving. It's a problem solving job. Get that job, but make sure it's a job you'd be happy to do and get paid for, even if you never end up doing wargaming. But once there, start introducing gaming-like activities as an approach to help the organization you've joined solve its problems. This is true of any consulting job, any organization whose activity involves going out and helping other organizations solve hard problems. Even if wargaming doesn't figure in the PD, get that job, then start introducing gaming. You can still keep looking for that wargaming job, that exclusive wargaming job elsewhere, but meanwhile you're employed.
Well, I'll actually just, to some degree, add some notes to Stephen's comments. I've worked for example, at automotive adhesives companies doing games. If you're gonna get a job at an automotive adhesive company and think that you're going to introduce gaming, you can, and they did, but it's only going to be 1 or 2 games. It's not going to be your primary job, and you're not going to have the kind of experience that someone on this panel would have in terms of running such a game. So there's a high risk of potential bad things happening to you as you try to do a game in front of all your management in a situation where you don't really know what you're doing. And so I think that there's a little bit of inherent danger in that if you just go out and do your dream job, which happens to be formulating automotive adhesives, and then you're trying to integrate games into that problem. So
this is called wargaming. If you're afraid of a little bit of danger, you're in the wrong business. Launch, especially the young kids on this thing. You can afford to get to screw up and flame out several times in your careers.
Yeah, and within government, it's a different story. I'm just using an counter example. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, like any job, it's got its own demographic HR elements that get laid on top of it that then influence how the market gets shaped. If you're looking at, if there are agencies that have full-time wargaming positions, oftentimes, as Ed has described, you're looking at the government spots. The government, any place where there's a large government concentration means there's a concentration of retirees who probably don't want to move, right? And that's why they're there. So they're the ones that start sucking up those local opportunities. They probably have a security clearance, which is huge. If you're going to try to get into government work, the absence of a security clearance is a problem. It used to be, well, just be clearance eligible, and then the time to get a security clearance for someone new became astronomical, that it'd be multiple years before we could get you employed in the manner to which we intended, if all we did was brought you on with an interim with the thing that we can upgrade you in a relatively short period of time. Not true anymore. So that starts to change kind of the who's willing to move and do what. And that becomes somewhat of a problem, even for organizations like where Don and I are at, in terms of you may have an opening and someone says, well, just, go advertise around some of the other government sites to see if we can lure someone to ours. It's like, again, it's probably the guy you want is probably a retiree who's already been at that institution where he is a wargamer now, who's got family embedded like ticks into the local community, and is not interested in upping sticks and moving to Newport. So the flexibility of being able to move around is key to getting your foot in the door. And you can't say, well, I really like the San Francisco area. Okay, then you've just made that your number one priority is geography, and that becomes a limiting factor for you then on where you're going to be able to find something in a wargaming perspective. On the other hand, you're happy to wargame anywhere, from coast to coast. Okay, then you got some options.
Yeah, and just to add a note to that, the higher the security clearance, the better. So, if you got the highest possible security clearance, you're going to be in demand no matter what it is you do, from emptying trash cans to wargaming to analysis.
So maybe a different way to look at the question, or a different perspective on it, might be how much do we think is a job that is 100% wargaming, and like your full-time job is to do wargaming, versus work for hire, as in you're not fully employed doing wargaming. I know at CNA we've got a group of 9, maybe 10 people that do wargaming full time, and another 1 or 2 that do a little bit that are also here at CNA, but we don't contract out to anyone else. We never like pull in a wargamer at a temporary basis contracting for hire. Does anybody else have any thoughts on the cut of those, what kind of work for hire capability is out there?
Well, I mean, in terms of, in terms of work for hire, you mean independent contractors like Stephen and myself. There's quite a few people that are running these sort of small business type situations where they can draw in other gamer. I mean, virtually a lot of the people on this call have actually worked at one time or another for me in one capacity or another in my small business. And so you can pull in people and sort of pull together a team of consultants if you're embedded in the community. Then yeah, there's some availability for that. I think the problem occurs is in big games and in classification because a lot of the small contractors can't maintain clearances.
It's interesting, kind of where this discussion's gone, because it's one of the things that we're wrestling with, kind of from a human capital strategy perspective. There's folks out there. If you look at us, we all kind of look similar here, trying to get a little bit of diversity into the community as well. And so, how do we draw people in, and how do we leverage folks without having them have to, in our case, move to Newport when people may be settled in the DC area or other places? And so we're looking at other ways of doing that, and maybe also non-traditional, 2000 or 1960 hour, years. Do we bring in somebody for 800 hours or 1,000 hours, part-time, and that works for them as they kind of go into a phased retirement? And that may work for us because we can put them against a surge effort on a particular project. So it's certainly something that I know we're looking at, and kind of maybe changing our human capital strategy model to be able to leverage talent in various places within the country, and different people within their in their job process or in their life process. But I would say probably numbers wise, I was going to take a swag at and say it's probably about 50-50. I was going to say that if you took the numbers of jobs that are at places within DOD, and then you took it places that, and I guess Pete's kind of an anomaly, right? A contractor that supports us at the War College. Is he a contractor in terms of this question or not? I think that could cut either way. I know McWill has contractors on site as well, as do a number of government locations. So when we say contractor, if we're saying contractors as in facilities that you go out to for a project, and they're, you're contracting with them for a particular effort, I would say probably 50-50. That may be an uneducated guess, but that seems to feel right to me. I don't think it's as high as 70-30. Maybe it's more like 60-40 or 40-60, but something, based on the numbers that you were kind of taking a swag at, Ed, that seems to kind of put me, I think, in that area. Maybe a good connections or MORS question in the future survey, try to figure out where is everybody? Where's Waldo?
Yeah, I'd say it's more like 45-10, with a 10 being the FFRDCs, because the FFRDCs sort of sit in the middle there between the contractors, and because they're not contractors. Get that through your head. They're not contractors. At the same time, they're not government. So they're special. So we're all special. Okay. Do we have another question? A one-off contract gigs for a specific wargame event versus full-time staff at a company. What's the ratio in the marketplace, and which one is easier to start with, not necessarily better? I'll just speak for myself. I think it's really hard to do one-offs if you're not very experienced. I mean, look who's doing their own stuff, like Pete, myself, Stephen. We all have a considerable amount of experience at doing war games. I would not step off and try to do events on your own. You'll get sucked into all kinds of crazy. But for the panel.
Yeah, you can't be an independent consultant without experience. It's that simple.
Yeah, and I think occasionally you'll see, because I know if you go over to the Georgetown University Wargaming Goose Society page, and you look at some of the job adverts that are on the job posting section, you will see stuff that initially looks, ooh, that looks interesting. Then you start to read the fine print, and it says, yeah, this is like for one academic year. It's a 9-month job, no guarantee for follow-on funding, etc. So then you've got to decide, okay, is it worth upping stumps and planting yourself in Leavenworth for less than a year, with the potential of having to move again, or you're going to roll the dice that maybe there's some potential follow-on work. That's always the danger. But I mean, it's the risk calculus that you as an individual have to go through in terms of there's an opportunity. It's not going to be something that somebody like me is going to be interested in, because I'm not going to move to Kansas for 9 months. But if you've got that wherewithal in terms of your own personal situation, it is getting some experience. It is getting in there. It is seeing the job done, and you'll get far more experience than if you do nothing for those 9 months. So that's always the tough part with those kind of short-term gigs. Is you've got to be at a place in your life where you can still be relatively nomadic, throw all your possessions in the back of your Honda and drive over to the horizon. We'll war game for food.
Yeah, and there's a lot of nuance here, right? When I say a short-term contract gig, I'm writing a contract for a specific game with an auto adhesives manufacturer or a blockchain company or something like that. That's my short-term gig. I'm sitting in my house. I'm doing what I normally do. It's not very disruptive. It can be if the game goes sideways, but that's one kind of contract gig. On the other hand, Pete has been at the War College since forever, and he's working for a contractor, but he's assigned to that billet, and he's going to be there forever as long as he keeps doing his job. And then on the other hand, Stephen comes in as a consultant a lot of times. I can't speak for Stephen, but I think he does things differently than either Pete or myself do. So that it kind of, there's a spectrum here of how you engage as a contractor.
I've been a full-time aerospace employee, full-time government employee, run my own consulting company. I've been on both sides, deployed with uniformed people to Afghanistan. Been on all sides of every bridge. If you're relatively inexperienced, well, you should be doing this whatever age you are. You should be networking furiously. And networking doesn't mean, just hanging on to other people. It means, engaging with people, exchanging what skills you have with them so they know what you do, you know what they do. And on occasion, I've been brought in by someone much more experienced at doing whatever it is we were going to do, because I could support that person with what it is I could do. So you may not be the person who goes and gets the one wargaming gig that's worth, a bundle of cash, but you may be the person brought on by that person because you can support that person with the specific skill sets you currently have. So networking with other wargamers who are more experienced than you.
Yeah, I would say, go ahead.
Traveling across the country for a 9-month gig sounds like terrible, right? But for an academic career, that's exactly what you do after you get your PhD, right? You're doing a postdoc for 2 years or 3 years, and then you're doing another postdoc and another postdoc. In the military, right, you're doing that for your entire career. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way to get gaming experience, and I'm not sure if we want to really funnel the wargame process or the education process, if we even should call it that, into a track that resembles the academic track. But getting a job at a wargaming adjacent place in a way that Stephen was talking about, supporting gamers, is probably one of the most available and ways to start building up that experience. If you can get a job at CNA or at RAND not doing gaming, and then slowly sidle up to the gamer folks, as somebody who got hired at CNA, not for a gaming position, that then saw a stack of board games on Peter Perla's desk and had my head whip around really, really fast.
Why is it always Peter? You know you talk to me.
Because his desk, his office was full of games. It was easy. And yours was just full of all those anime characters all over the. So then then I started sidling up to the games and found the niche, right? But it's a way of getting close to games and getting some exposure to them before you have a chance to start building that slow experience, while, as Stephen rightly and importantly mentions, you are employed and building that experience at the same time.
Yeah, actually, Jeremy, I wanted to, that's something that I think is incredibly important, because I found my way into gaming through geospatial analysis and just sort of understand. Then it was through making maps and then sort of working my way up the design chain. And that's exactly right. It's the experience. It's getting sometimes in the orbit of gamers, and like somebody else mentioned, what skills you do have, right? It's saying, oh, okay, well, I do need that skill in this case. And then sort of once you're in the orbit, it's a lot easier. So that's an interesting, or I think a really important insight you highlighted there.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Ed, I can also probably make a shameless plug for some of the stuff that you do with MORS from a standpoint of getting folks some experience in the wargaming space. And I guess that would be more educational than experiential, but I know there's an experiential aspect to the courses that you run. And so folks either, there's other places out there. King's, I think, has some curriculum now. The stuff that you do through MORS. If I have somebody coming in who wants to, kind of an entry-level wargamer who doesn't have experience having designed, developed, or analyzed war games, but has gone out and made the effort to learn about the craft, right? To the ability that they can through courses and that type of thing, seminars. I would see that from a hiring perspective, that would give somebody a leg up, that they've made the effort to do that, and they've at least dipped their toe in the water. And the more they've done that, and to what degree, may actually, it would, in my opinion, on a hiring board, would put them in better stead than someone who didn't have that background.
Yeah, and just to clarify, what Don's talking about is MORS runs this. I coordinate a series of courses for MORS, running from general wargaming to tactics to cyber and homeland security, that provides certificates in a company with Virginia Tech, and we're going to be talking about that on Thursday a little bit more. But yeah, we do have those training courses, as do other people as well. In addition, there's a community of practice in MORS, and there's also sections at the MORS conference on wargaming. So one of the things about life is the more you show up, the more opportunities you get simply by continuing to show up. And if you show up someplace long enough, eventually they'll give you something to do. That generally applies to wargaming as well, whether you're in the organization or whether you're just coming to conferences and stuff, coming to connections, coming to the community of practice, coming to the session of MORS at the convention. All those things, you just show up and eventually say, hey, you're part of the team. And, come on, let's go. So do we have another question? Do you anticipate future job requirements to have an increase in Agile practitioner requirements? If you mean agility in terms of physical agility, I would say no, because people in wargaming are physically agile. Mental agility is required but seldom found. And in terms of agile, in terms of software development and agility with technology, I think that's kind of it's something that people are fascinated with. I'm not sure how much real impact it has on actual day-to-day wargaming. So I'll turn it over to the panel. Anybody have any comments?
I'll throw a comment because I apparently can't seem to keep my mouth shut. So when when someone explained Agile in program management to me, I said, "Oh, you mean doing the job right and well? Oh, okay. In that case, sure, we do that too." There were a lot of the specifics that didn't make sense, and I think it's a very cultural basis. I think people are going to have different expectations for how you run your projects and what requirements there are from that kind of management standpoint. From a perspective of practitioner requirements as being able to do multiple different things, at CNA, we value being able to be plug and play in a lot of different things. It sounds like the Naval War College is a little bit different in trying to add more specialization. But I think in smaller organizations, CNA is not a tiny organization, but the wargaming team is less than 10 folks. So being able to be plugged into anything and everything whenever is relevant and raising your hands to do whatever happens to come down the road, I think is relevant and important. So I don't think there's an increased level of agility. I just think the field requires a high level of both of mental agility and emotional and social agility, and not physical agility, as Ed mentioned.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, I'll add to it, not to steal Don's thunder, in terms of the War College, they're increasingly identifying the specializations in terms of role. You still want to be the guy, though, that when we're looking at your resume going, wow, we could put him in the development group, you could put him in the design group, we could put him you're still in better shape than if all we do is go, yeah, he's a great fit for analysts, but right now we're chocker block with analysts. That's not where we're shopping. Oh, well, we'll stick him on the shelf for, maybe future consideration for one of those guys leave. So yeah, there's still value in that generalization skill set to be able to participate in all the different aspects of the war game, war games from cradle to grave. We're using that to emphasize our sponsors. They usually all get lifted up in the week of the game. We have to keep reminding them. Remember, your week of execution is the smallest fragment of the entire life cycle on a war game. And being able to be a team player, everyone wants a team player, within the context of the design phase, the development phase, the testing analysis phase, the post and archiving phase, is still important. And being able to have that flexible approach that says that when we say, well, we don't need you here, but we need you here. And you go, yeah, great, I'm still interested. Okay.
Yeah, that sort of agility is true for any job. I mean, if you're very narrowly focused on one particular thing, if suddenly the contract expires for that one particular thing, or in the government, if the requirement goes away for that one particular thing, you go away as well or find something else to do. So,
yeah, Ed, if I could just, I guess, add to Pete's comment, I know I've talked about this idea of kind of specialization, and those terms may not, to some of the folks in the audience, may be kind of foreign. So maybe I ought to at least provide just a moment of kind of some clarification. When we talk, as many of the folks here have talked about, kind of game design, kind of being the whole tamale, right? Does, from tasking through objectives, through designing the various processes and mechanisms, then through into execution, and then through analysis. We've kind of broken that up in kind of our wargaming model that we do at the college. And the way we see it, we oftentimes use this analogy of an architect and a building contractor. So we think of the game designer like an architect who's designing the game kind of theoretically to some degree to meet the requirements of the customer, the homeowner. But yet at the end of the day, the contractor is the person who has to take that design and execute it. And in our cases, make it a playable game to be able to get useful data that meets the game objectives, right? So we've come full circle. And so in our case, design isn't just a 2-week period where we design the game processes, but it's an interactive process as we go into development and we find out that there's glitches maybe in the design that we have to go back and tweak or modify as we go through. So there's kind of this give and take between the design phase and the development phase, and the analyst is there the whole time making sure that whatever changes are made to the process are ultimately serving the analysis effort at the end of the day, because if we don't come up with good data that meets the game objectives and the game purpose, then we shouldn't have done the game. It may have been an interesting, fun game for the participants, but if it doesn't scratch the sponsor's analytical itch, assuming it's an analytical game and not an experiential game, then we've failed to meet the mark. So when we talk about design and development, that's kind of how we kind of, capture them. Not really I don't think in the wargaming parlance, a framework, a formal framework that often people adhere to, but one that you'll hear us use kind of that terminology, kind of drift in and drift out, if that's helpful for people when we talk about that.
Okay, I think we have one more question in the chat. So let's pop that up here. Further question, what is the estimated breakdown of games as a training tool rather than generating specific insights for a client? Statistics.
I'll jump on that only from a Title 10 perspective. Most of the gaming that we do at the War College is analytical as opposed to educational / experiential. That said, we would offer, and I think most of you would agree, that all games have experiential aspects to them. And sometimes the goal is to make sure that that experiential is not a negative experience, right? That coming away from a game, that people aren't learning the wrong lessons from the way the game was designed and executed, about either certain capabilities, concepts, or outcomes. But we are looking now at exactly the piece of educational, experiential, and incorporating more gaming into the curriculum at the college as an effective educational tool, vice and necessarily just an analytical tool. But right now, certainly the vast majority of our gaming is an analytical, vice educational, experiential.
Yeah, and I think part of this gets into, especially if we consider who we all represent here, some of the just as a legal boundaries and where organizations, especially the government, is able to spend money with outside agencies. So while a organization may have a problem set that they think is going to be interesting to explore through a wargaming approach, and odds are that they can find a Stephen, find an Ed that can help them out with that sort of problem set. What you're not going to find very often is a schoolhouse that has very specific Title 10 training and readiness requirements going outside of military faculty to get wargaming for that purpose. They just run into some icky problems in terms of just the way the Center for Naval Education and Training is structured, and some of the requirements and restrictions on who can teach, who can be in a training position, and whether those can be outside agencies or not. And then you, again, run into all sorts of nasty contracting problems around that. So there tends to be more availability of the specific insight for a client type stuff than there is necessarily on the training side of the house, simply because the training side of the house falls under a different funding and legal structure when it comes to Title 10 stuff.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems you get into when you start talking about training games as opposed to analytical games is you get into the entire digital space. And then at ITSEC Orlando, they have lots and lots of training games that are, cyber awareness training is a game, right? Very bad game. No one likes it. But nonetheless, cyber awareness training is kind of a game. So I think it becomes very fuzzy once you move off of the dot for this kind of analytical gaming that we tend to be focused on and in the training. Well, obviously you can do that. I just don't. I think in some cases if you're looking for just statistics, you're going to a lot of training tools, and a lot of them will be digital, and they will not be paper and pencil, and many of them may be online and may not be what you're thinking of. So,
and it's also really hard to count them. I think I know. The people that come to CNA, as you talked about, and want to pay money for a game, I would say 90 to 95% of them are for insights as opposed to educational or training tools. But if you look at any of the schoolhouses, Marine Corps University, TRADOC, right, they do gaming all the time. And a professor might develop a game that they use for their classes as a training tool or as an educational tool that we wouldn't know about because it's just not something that makes it onto PAC Sims, for example. So I think from a professional wargamer perspective, the educational schoolhouses don't have the money to pay for something like a contractor or an FFRDC, and the educational tools are going to be seen as small. So I think the number is probably higher than any of us know.
Okay, I think we have one more question. I think we keep getting new questions, and I keep extending the deadline. So, for the panel, what about the portion of wargaming that supports exercises? Well, I'll start off right from the top and say that war games, as you well know, if you're on this call, probably are not exercises. Exercises work in the real world. War games work in the virtual space and are about the players, not the systems that you're trying to run. And so a lot of times you'll have a war game that can do things that exercises cannot do, and therefore you run the war game to see what happens when you sink the carrier, because in the exercise you cannot sink the carrier because they need to get flight hour training and quals. But I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
No, I think it's spot on, Ed, in terms of I always cringe when I get the whole war game exercise used interchangeably and people are talking about an event and or worse. So it's one thing when, at least when you have someone who's thinking about, okay, what about the exercise support shop that's part of an organization to do exercise design? Okay, Roger. It's when someone says, ooh, couldn't we get more bang for our buck if we combo platter and we start bringing in war game elements, not involving real troops, in some sort of abstract synthetic environment, and at the same time we're going to run the exercisey part too. That way we get, again, more bang for our buck. And this is the classic millennial challenge nightmare when you start to try to add those portions. And oftentimes when people kind of bring those sorts of things to me, I kind of emphasize right away, remember the flexibility that wargaming gives you in terms of stop the problem, stop the clock. War games are really relatively cheap compared to, okay, we've just gotten underway a small task force which has a limited number of steaming hours per their training budget. They've got to have safety concerns. They've got to operate in the real world. They've got to stay within the warning areas. You've got to worry about the weather. All the things that we do not care about in a wargaming environment. That said, there is a connection there in terms of back to hiring, right? And in terms of what our panel is about, in terms of if I get someone who came from a fleet shop that was in their exercise design development type things, already that's at least something I can put in the plus column, because a lot of the thought process of laying out and structuring an exercise, whether you're using the infamous HSEEP, as Ed mentioned earlier, which is Homeland Security's exercise design program, or the JELC for the joint what's that? JELC, right? The joint exercise life cycle. For those sorts of exercises, at least you're being forced into breaking activities down and thinking about the very systemic pieces parts, and then understanding how you're going to reassemble those parts such that you're focusing on the parts that you need to focus on to get the outcomes you're interested in, and how then to minimize the friction from the parts you're not interested in. Well, that's some early steps in wargame design. So value there, but clearly not the same thing.
So Peter has just described how to take your set of experiences and expertise, if you're an exercise support person and you're applying for a wargaming job. He's just explained to you how you insert in the wargaming requirements about how your expertise supports wargaming.
I would just add, I guess, the fact that I see that there is a cycle, if you would, of analysis, right? As we develop, say, new concepts. And to Pete's point, I'd much rather start off wargaming a concept and getting a bit more fidelity in what that looks like regarding time, space, and force, to be able to then incorporate that into an exercise, because resources are limited, they're expensive. And once I've gamed that, if you would, maybe started out with some type of a workshop or tabletop, right? Moved into some type of a wargaming environment. And then once it's mature enough as a concept, we could then take that into an exercise to see if it really does work in the physical world, within our constraints on our processes and all those things. So I see it as kind of part of a cycle, but not necessarily a war game specifically that's part of an exercise, but that's really more part of the analytical arc, with both exercises and wargaming being valid tools within that arc of research, just like campaign analysis and modeling and emulations and many other things that we could do, depending on the fidelity of the concepts and things that we're looking at.
And you know, exercises also support. I'll throw it to Steve in just a second. Exercises also support war games, right? If I do a bunch of exercises, I can calculate how many times a sub penetrates the ASW barrier and gets the aircraft carrier. So that's helpful to me in my war game, and it's helpful to me to argue against carrier commanders and surface commanders who think they can find the submarine. So it's very useful. I'll turn it over to Steve.
Oh, and I was just going to say, and this is where being able to sort of go back to sort of what is the question that you're trying to answer, or the thing that you're trying to get after, and sort of contextualize for people where those things fit in, I think is really important, right? You were talking about sort of the cycle of analysis, right? And sort of being able to explain or think about when you are talking to people and trying to pitch yourself for a position, right? Where, you know, these things fit in, to sort of understand that it's one tool amongst many. There's places for all of these things, and being able to sort of position all of those things is critically important, and also how all the experience interrelates, I think, is an important skill to spend, or thing to be thinking about, and sort of when you do have the opportunity to sort of either in a resume or an interview talk about that, if it comes up. I think that's really important.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the panel. That's the end of the questions. I'd like to thank the panel very much for coming and doing this. I guarantee you at least one poor person's resume probably hit the circular bin by accident during the course of this panel, simply because the panelists weren't there to look at it. And some senior manager got a hold of it, and they don't need no Wargamers. So I want to thank all of you for doing this. I want to thank everybody for participating. We had very good participation in the chat. We had a lot of people watching, and hopefully you get something out of it. And hopefully this helps answer the questions that we get a lot of times about how to enter into wargaming, what it takes, and what people look for when they're trying to hire wargamers. Once again, this will be repeated again with Connections US in person, hopefully. During Connections US, just Google Connections US Wargaming, and you'll come up with the website. And we're going to redo the panel, and hopefully we'll have a few more Army guys and a little more different people on the panel. But I really appreciate everybody here doing this. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.